Professor Finkelstein, thank you very much for joining our interview series. Let me start right away with the first question. Drawing on Gaza, an inquest into martyrdom, how do you conceptualize Gaza today? Blockade, occupation, siege, apartheid, genocide, and how do you explain Israel's persistent impunity despite extensive documentation of international humanitarian law and international human rights law violations?
Well, there's an expression in English, there's nothing new under the sun. And for those who have studied the history of Gaza, in particular since 1967, it can't be said that Israel has pioneered new methods since October 7th, 2023. What has changed, and changed very significantly, what has changed is the magnitude of the Israeli repression in Gaza. And there is also another expression that at some point quantity turns into quality. That is to say, if the magnitude has significantly increased of the Israeli death and destruction in Gaza, then qualitatively we're talking about something new. So even though the methods are not new, the quantity is of such a altogether different magnitude, then we're talking about a qualitatively different phenomenon. What does that mean in practice? Well, let's just take one simple comparison. During the last of Israel's massive killing sprees in Gaza, Operation Protective Edge, that was in August 2014. It lasted approximately lasted about 51 days. And during Operation Protective Edge, about 18,000 homes were destroyed, about 550 children were killed. The head of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Peter Maurer, when he toured Gaza after Operation Protective Edge, he said in his entire career he had not ever seen such a magnitude of destruction. Well, compare that with today. Then it was 18,000 homes. Now the estimates are it's 200,000 homes destroyed, and the estimate is about 92 or more percent of all the housing in Gaza has been pulverized. Then it was 550 children. Now the estimates are 20,000 plus children have been killed. So it's quantitatively of an altogether different magnitude. And so it's qualitatively a different phenomenon. Now, what does that mean practically? Practically, that means that Israel in the past has carried out what it calls mowings of the lawn in Gaza. That is to say, these are high-tech killing sprees, basically to remind the people in Gaza. That's strange, I turned it off. Basically to remind the people in Gaza who is in charge, in this case, Israel. But after October 7th, the Israelis realized that they had not just a crisis, but they had an opportunity. And the opportunity that flowed from the crisis, the opportunity was to resolve the Gaza question for once and for all. And in effect, that meant to implement the final solution to the Gaza question. And the final solution to the Gaza question basically meant one way or another, to empty out Gaza. It could be ethnic cleansing. It could be making Gaza uninhabitable, so the people of Gaza, by hook or by crook, would figure out a way to leave. Or it could also mean mass extermination. And the Israeli policy over the past 2 years has been a combination of those three things. Ethnic cleansing, that was the goal at the very beginning, to empty out the population into the northern Sinai. That didn't work for various reasons. Then the massive destruction of Gaza to make it uninhabitable. What they're doing right now in the last habitable spot of Gaza, which is Gaza City, they will reduce it to what they have reduced the north of Gaza, what they've reduced Rafah. Now they will do in Gaza, and there will be nothing left. It will just be a wasteland of rubble. And in order to break the backs of the people of Gaza, in order to soften the target so that they will leave once and for all, they're engaging in a policy of mass famine and mass extermination. The second part of your question was, why have they been able to get away with it with impunity despite the massive documentation? Well, during all of Israel's previous operations, there was massive documentation. After Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, there was the voluminous Goldstone report, which was authored by a South African Jew who also called himself a Zionist. And it was a devastating report on what Israel had done to Gaza. Just collected dust. There was that report was commissioned by the Human Rights Council. There was another report after Operation Protective Edge, commissioned by the Human Rights Council. It was also devastating. It also just ended up collecting dust. So however much documentation is accumulated, turning these commissions of inquiry or human rights documentation into an actual implementation of the law is, as is pretty obvious at this point, not easy.
Right. On the genocide claim, which probative elements, specific intent, patterns of destructive acts, official statements, engineered humanitarian deprivation, do you judge strongest or weakest? And how should advocates avoid both over and under pleading?
That's a very good question, in my opinion. I think the goal is to empty out Gaza. That to me is the goal. They don't care very much whether the people of Gaza end up in Tahiti, Samoa, the Solomon Islands, Nauru, Tuvalu. They don't care, just as long as they have solved the Gaza question. You should bear in mind that was also Hitler's view. Up until up until the late 1930s, and maybe later, maybe in the early 40s, the goal was to transfer the European Jews out of Europe. And there were all sorts of plans afoot in different parts of the world to transfer them. That goal ceased to be viable after World War II broke out, and the seas were not places of free travel. And so that's when they switched to the extermination plan. The Israel wants to empty out Gaza, and one of the ways to empty out Gaza is to make it unlivable. There's nothing to, as the Israelis have said over and over again, we will give the people of Gaza two choices: to stay and starve or to leave. And secondly, the mass extermination is a component of the plan, because that's There are two aspects to the mass extermination. Well, there are three aspects to the mass extermination. Aspect number one is just pure bloodlust. The Israelis were outraged, and that's a euphemism. They were outraged at what happened on October 7th, and they were determined to exact blood, the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, except in the case of the Israelis, judging by what was recently said by a former Israeli senior official. I think he was the former head of Israeli intelligence. He said that for every Israeli killed, 50 Gazans have to be killed. Now, he said that, okay, I'll return to that in a moment. So there was the bloodlust component, and that's in a significant part what explains not just the killing in Gaza, but the jubilation with which it's carried out. The fact that they broadcast it all over their social media, how they are wreaking death and destruction on Gaza. So the extermination is in part, it springs from bloodlust. A second aspect of the extermination is it's what Israel calls restoring its deterrence capability. That is, after October 7th, the idea started to pass through the heads of many people in the Arab world. Well, maybe there is a military option against Israel. If this ragtag guerrilla army assembled by Hamas, if it could have inflicted so much damage on Israel, maybe there is a military option. And so Israel had to transmit the message. If you have the notion passing through your skull that there's a military option against us, look at Gaza. So the mass extermination was also designed to restore what Israel calls its deterrence capability. That is, the Arab world's fear of it. That's what they mean by deterrence capability. And the third aspect is the mass extermination is a way of breaking the will of the people of Gaza and also the international community. The international community talks about ceasefire and rehabilitation. The goal of the mass extermination is to tell the world there's not going to be a ceasefire and there's not going to be rehabilitation. They have to leave. And one way of convincing them they have to leave is to kill them en masse and also to deprive them of any of the basic necessities to sustain life. There is nothing left in Gaza now. I mean, I don't know where people get these ideas about reconstruction. If you look at the official reports, they say it would take 50 years now to rebuild Gaza. Gaza has been pulverized. There's nothing there. It's a vast wasteland. So I think extermination has been a means to the end of resolving the Gaza question. But if it's a means to the end, it's still a genocide. You're using genocidal means to achieve the end of resolving the Gaza question. The fact that it's a means and not an ends does not prove it's not genocide. They're using genocidal means to achieve the end of resolving the Gaza question.
Right. What standards of sourcing, chain of custody, and methodological transparency should scholars and NGOs adopt to preempt disinformation, rebuttals, while remaining legible to courts and broader publics?
I don't think, unlike others who seem to believe that the key to gaining authoritative information about Gaza is admitting journalists. First of all, we've met much higher standards of proof than journalistic evidence from the superfluity of human rights and humanitarian UN-affiliated organizations that have been transmitting information on literally a daily basis, to prove that Gaza has crossed the threshold of famine. There is this very subtle system of accounting by international humanitarian groups. So there's food deprivation, there is starvation, there is famine. It's different degrees. In order to discern at which threshold you stand, it requires very precise information. And when they came to the conclusion that about 1 million people in Gaza now are in famine conditions, they needed very precise accounting because these are very rigorous, stringent organizations. They need very precise accounting to validate the claim of famine or starvation or extreme food deprivation. There are so many organizations working in Gaza, Save the Children, World Food Program, UNICEF, UNESCO, Doctors Without Borders, UNCTAD, UN Commission on Trade and Development, World Bank, International Monetary Fund. All of them are on the ground. We have a voluminous documentary record. Just to give you one example, the South African delegation to the International Court of Justice, it submitted what's called a memorial, which is its main documentation of the genocide in Gaza. It hasn't yet been released to the public, but you know how long it is? It's 700 pages with 4,000 pages of documentation. There's no dearth of documentation. And frankly, as against the organizations I've listed, the journalistic reportage is the least reliable. These are just people who are fly in and fly out. They have very little knowledge of the situation in Gaza. They are highly partisan, the journalists. They have to basically report what their editors want them to report when it comes to Israel and Palestine. So in my opinion, we have reached the uppermost threshold of accuracy in documentation when it comes to Gaza. We don't need any more.
Right.
As you know, all the major human rights organizations have concluded, Amnesty concluded that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. Human Rights Watch concluded that Israel is committing genocidal acts in Gaza. The Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, B'Tselem, concluded that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. The overwhelming majority of so-called experts in genocide, of those who responded to the recent poll, I think it has 500 members, that organization, scholars who studied genocide, 28% responded to a recent poll as to whether Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. And of that, of the response rate, 80% or 86% said they're committing genocide. So I don't think the problem at this point is documentation. I think a imposed famine is a human-made famine is proof of genocide.
Right. How do you assess the likelihood, modalities, and timelines of large-scale displacement from Gaza to Egypt or beyond? Which regional veto players, Egypt, Hezbollah, Gulf states, most credibly deter or enable such outcomes, and why?
I think I don't think it's easy to predict where that will head. Israel is trying to amass the entire population of Gaza now on the southern border. At some point, it's quite, and President Trump has given them the green light, but also he signaled you have to get this job done soon because the pressure building on the US is steadily increasing. So my guess, and I have no military knowledge whatsoever, so I have to make that clear, they will mass as many people as they can on the southern border, and then they will start bombing it relentlessly. And then the pressure is going to be built on Egypt. You have to let them in because nobody's stopping Israel. And how Egypt will respond to that is an open question, I believe. There will be images all around the world of Israel relentlessly bombing 2 million people. The people are screaming to be let into Egypt. And will Egypt be able to resist that pressure? I'm not sure.
All right. Which institutional pathways, US Security Council shielding, lawfare, diplomatic narrative management, most decisively sustain Israeli impunity, and where are the most realistic choke points for pressure?
Look, the US has been an obstacle, but it's not altogether true to say it's an insurmountable obstacle. There are various UN mechanisms for getting around the US veto in the Security Council. There's what's called the United for Peace possibility in the General Assembly. I won't get into the technicalities because they're not of any interest, because it's not going to happen. And secondly, the Europeans can exert their own, the Europe is Israel's main trading, EU is Israel's main trading partner, not the US, the EU. And they have many options. The problem is not institutional or bureaucratic obstructionism. The problem is the lack of will. What could be done now? I don't believe much can be done now. I don't like to be the bearer of bad news. On the other hand, I believe treating adults like adults. If we're in an impasse, we're at an impasse. If people were willing to escalate their resistance, then I do believe there are options. There are possibilities to just close down the Israeli terminals at the major airports. If you can amass enough people to go to the airports and be willing to get arrested. And I think most people are willing to get arrested. I think the problem is organization. Organizational, I don't want to use big words, but like organizational vision. There are ways, I think. There was an announcement, as I'm sure you know, by the dock workers in Genoa that they're sending over a flotilla to Gaza. And if Israelis attack that flotilla, there will be a price to pay in terms of commerce on the seas. Whether that's just talk or whether there's an action plan behind it, there are things that can be done, I believe. But that requires will and organization.
Right. You have criticized UN handling of conflict-related sexual violence. What does the annexed controversy reveal about the political economy of UN norm setting, evidentiary thresholds, and great power leverage?
The UN, as anybody who works in it will tell you, is a profoundly corrupt organization. On the other hand, it does a lot of good things. And you have to balance both those factors. I think there's a lot of corruption in the UN and affiliated bodies like the ICC. And I've just completed a new book called Gaza's Gravediggers, an inquiry into corruption in high places, which speaks to specific individuals and specific events where, in my opinion, either individuals are either being bribed or blackmailed by Israel. I mentioned to you earlier in this conversation, I mentioned the Goldstone report. And the Goldstone report was a devastating indictment of Israel's actions, conduct during Operation Cast Lead. Within a few months of the issuance of the report, Goldstone retracted the report. And in my opinion, he retracted it because he was blackmailed. If you read the record as I have, there's no other explanation. The former chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, her name was Fatou Bensouda. She was the chief prosecutor of the ICC. There's no question in my mind, she was the one responsible for handling the case of the Mavi Marmara. That was a flotilla of ships that went to Gaza in May 31st, 2010. And it came under attack by Israel and 10 passengers were killed. She was responsible for that case. And there was no question in my mind that she was blackmailed into giving Israel a pass. The former president of the ICJ, Joan Donoghue, she was an American. As you know, in January 2024, the ICJ, the main legal arm of the United Nations, it found that Israel was plausibly committing genocide. In April 2024, Joan Donoghue appeared on a BBC program called Hard Talk, and she just flagrantly, blatantly lied. And she said that the ICJ did not find that Israel was plausibly committing genocide. It was just the most flagrant, outrageous lie. And the current vice president of the ICJ, Judge Sebutindi, Julia Sebutindi, she is a fanatic, but I don't think she's a Christian evangelical fanatic. But beyond that, it's my opinion that she's being either bribed or blackmailed by Israel and has been delivering these outrageous dissents in the ICJ jurisprudence. I have, in the forthcoming book, I have a 100-page chapter just documenting her lies in her dissents. So, and then there's the last case, the most recent one. without going into the detail, which can't be done over a broadcast, there is no evidence in the traditional sense of evidence, medical evidence, forensic evidence, digital evidence. There is no evidence that Hamas weaponized rape on October 7th. There is none. They admit it. There isn't an issue there. There is no digital evidence of rape. There is no what they call medical legal evidence of rape. There is no, the only thing there is quote unquote witnesses. That's it. There's none. Whereas on the other side, there's voluminous evidence of Israelis committing rape, rape of men, threatened rape of women, and massive sexual violence. In the face of that, every year the UN puts out a report on sexual violence in conflict situations. That's what it's called. Conflict-related sexual violence, CRSV, conflict-related sexual violence. And there was a lot of pressure put on Guterres, the Secretary General, to list Hamas in what's called their appendix. List in the appendix to the report Hamas as a committer of sexual violence and to exclude Israel. And that's what Guterres did. He listed Hamas and excluded Israel. And that was another blackmail.
Right. Thus, contemporary Zionism now shape Israeli military doctrine in Gaza toward...
I don't think that's true. I don't think it has much to do. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Zionism. So I have a certain amount, there I can claim a certain amount of expertise. Nothing has much to do with Zionism. It's a Jewish supremacist state. And it's carrying on in a fashion not unlike South Africa. Remember, when South Africa, beyond its white supremacy, it was engaged in all of these neighboring colonial wars with Mozambique, with Angola. The South Africans killed like 1 million people then during the 1970s and 80s, during the anti-colonial wars that were going on the border of South Africa. And also, of course, in Namibia, they were waging the colonial war against SWAPO, the Southwest African People's Organization. And it was a massive bloodletting. Literally, I think it was more than 1 million people. You can check and you can correct me. And that's Israel. Israel is a Jewish supremacist state determined to maintain a Jewish supremacist state within its borders and to crush any resistance on its periphery, which was the same thing with South Africa, because you're too young to remember, but in South Africa in Mozambique, there was Frelimo, led by Samora Machel. He was probably assassinated by the South Africans. It's not known for sure. He was killed in the plane flight. So there was the Frelimo in Angola. It was the MPLA, the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola. And so just like Israel has on its periphery, it had Hezbollah, Iran, Syria, and was periodically carrying out mass death and destruction to maintain its regional hegemony. Israel, South Africa, to maintain its system of white supremacy and regional hegemony, it carried out the same sorts of massacres. It's very, it has something to do with Zionism, but I don't think it has yeah, Zionism they wanted a Jewish state, just like South Africa wanted a white state. But I think invoking ideologies like Zionism, I think it sort of confuses what's going on for most people who didn't, like myself, sit down for several years and read everything on Zionism to write a dissertation. If you say to people, this is a Jewish supremacist state determined to keep a state that's more or less purely Jewish and to retain its hegemony, its dominance in the region, like South Africa, you have a pretty clear picture of what's going on.
Right. And lastly, Professor Finkelstein, how do right-wing and liberal US populisms intersect to normalize Gaza's suffering via identity-based mobilization, security mythologies, and the bipartisan fortress democracy frame?
There's, in the Democratic Party, which is a mixture at the base, I don't want to talk about the leadership. The Democratic Party at the base, it's a mixture of people belonging to minorities and basically liberal in their persuasions. Those two constituencies are not going to support a genocide in Gaza. Right now, the support for Israel in the Democratic Party is heading, it may already be in the single digits. I think it's like 9%, but I can't remember because there's so many numbers to remember. But it's drastically reduced. In the Republican Party, among younger Republicans, support for Israel has drastically reduced, but older Republicans, supporters of Trump, it's still significantly high. I think it's very difficult right now to defend Israel in the United States. You have to come across as a psychopath or a moron. Otherwise, it's impossible to defend.
Right. Professor Finkelstein, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.